you're not even gonna know that it happened.
Who did this to you?
You did.
You really want to get this guy, don't you?
The protagonist in this film suffers from a form of amnesia where he can't remember the recent past. He spends most of the film looking for who killed his wife, only to learn that he was her killer. And I didn't just choose this movie because I can sympathize with someone who has trouble remembering things. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. The gang are friends with yet another famous rock singer, Jimmy Lewis, who invites them to a session at his record label's studio. There they encounter a garish ghost of a failed musician seeking revenge on those who ruined his career.
Like that Jimmy Lewis sure sings a mean song.
That Jimmy Lewis sure sings a mean song. Except no one was singing. Setting that aside, I can't quite figure out how the writers came up with this name. Usually it's obvious, like how in the Pterodactyl Ghost episode, the singer on the radio was named Elvis John, an obvious reference to both Elvis Presley and Elton John. So who was Jimmy Lewis referring to? Jerry Lee Lewis? If so, that's an interesting choice for Hanna-Barbera, considering the age of their target audience and the age of Jerry Lee Lewis's target dating pool. Why are Velma and Fred sitting on Daphne and Shaggy's laps? I could see Velma wanting Daphne to sit on her lap, but the Shaggy and Fred thing here might have opened up a whole new realm for fanfiction.
We're friends of Jimmy Lewis.
He asked us down to watch him record tonight.
Well, he didn't say nothing about it to me.
Hey, you made it. It's okay, Joe. They're friends of mine.
Oh look, another 8-foot-tall giant in a Scooby episode. Also, what's up with that uniform? The brown tie I can understand, but why a brown hat with a blue uniform? Did Joe grab the wrong hat on his way to work? Was he getting made fun of all night about it? Was that why he was so grouchy when the gang arrived?
Come on in, we're about to start.
Shouldn't Joe be a little concerned about letting a huge, unleashed Great Dane into a recording studio filled with expensive equipment? Time to fire a security guard. The nephew of the owner of a popular record label plotted to steal albums from his uncle's business to sell on his own. When another employee discovered the theft, the nephew disguised himself as the ghost of a dead rock star and kidnapped the man to prevent him from spilling the beans. This time around, it's relatively easy to determine the rough value of the villain's scheme. Not only can it be estimated just how much was stolen, but the value of the merchandise at the time this episode aired is reasonably well documented.
This is the shipping room where they send my records to the record shops all over the country. Those 10 stacks are being shipped first thing in the morning.
10? I only count 6, Jimmy.
There are only 6.
Those records should not have been stacked like that. Vinyl albums are meant to be stored vertically to prevent warping or bending their corners. Not to mention, it would be awkward and inefficient to handle loose merchandise as shown here, which is why shipping containers are a thing. Worse, each stack would weigh hundreds of pounds each, and the record stacked on the bottom would be crushed by the cumulative weight of all those on top. Incidentally, I know I make fun of the animators all the time for not getting scale correct, but come on! Those records are twice the size they should be in this shot. Going by the height of Fred and Jimmy standing next to them, each stack of records is roughly 9 feet tall. Packaged vinyl LPs are approximately 3 millimeters thick, which means each stack likely contained around 900 albums. It's reasonable to assume that the missing stacks were likely the same height and contain the same amount. And while a few hundred from those were left behind, it can be safely inferred that the nephew stole a little over 3,000 records. In 1978, the average retail price of a vinyl LP was a little over $7. If the nephew was able to sell them for that much, he would make around $21,000, or a little over $100,000 in today's money. That's assuming the nephew would be able to get his buyers to pay the full retail cost, which isn't likely. The only reason anyone would purchase what they would assume was a bootleg copy of a popular album is if it was a lot cheaper than obtaining one from a legitimate source. I'm guessing any buyers would assume the albums were counterfeit because even if the nephew insisted they were legitimate and not cheap knockoffs, that's what all shady record sellers would claim. Under those conditions, he'd be lucky to get even half the retail value, which would make what he stole worth closer to $10,000 or $50,000 in today's money. It's possible the nephew could have been planning to sell the albums directly to unscrupulous music stores whose owners knew that the merchandise was legitimate, just illegally obtained, but that only means he'd earn even less than what he could get by selling directly to people on the street. The regular wholesale cost to record stores is often 50% of the retail price, which means if they sell an album for $7, they would have paid $3.50 to buy it from the factory. What would be the incentive of any store owner to pay the same wholesale price to the nephew for what they could get legally from the record label and not risk arrest for accepting stolen merchandise? The nephew would have had to make it worthwhile for them, selling the stolen albums for much less than normal wholesale, possibly as low as 25%. That would leave him making just around $5,000, or $25,000 in today's money. Then again, it's possible the nephew could have been planning on delivering the albums to the record stores himself without them knowing the merchandise was stolen. He was the company owner's nephew after all, and they probably would have assumed everything was legitimate, while he pocketed their payment. We're never told the nephew's position at the company, so his job very well could have been head of distribution. However, any payments from the retail stores would likely have been in the form of checks mailed to the record company and not through cash handed to the driver. This still feels like the best case scenario to maximize the value of this scheme, making it worth roughly $50,000 in today's money. While greed is universal for most criminals, knowing the nephew's actual motivation might have an impact on the value of his plot. After all, this seems like such a paltry amount for someone who came from a wealthy family. Did the nephew have gambling debts? A drug addiction? Was he angry at his uncle for refusing to sign a contract with the garage band he and his friends from high school are trying to put together, and this was his way of getting revenge? It's never said, but this episode would have benefited by exploring this side of things. Motivation aside, the nephew could have lowered the risk of getting caught if he had access to the company's accounting department and manipulated the books to hide the illicit sales. While this would have given him the best opportunity to steal the records for the maximum amount of profit, it would also have been very dangerous because any internal audit would immediately show that the number of records produced did not match the number of records sold. Anyone tied to the accounting department would be the first authorities would suspect. Everything depends on if this was just the latest theft or if it was the first time the nephew pulled his heist. I'm willing to bet it was the first time because it wouldn't take long for those managing the inventory to realize that almost half their merchandise was unaccounted for. The nephew's score will suffer for how easy it would be for this scheme to be uncovered. Then again, he was the record company's nephew. If he gets caught, would his uncle press charges, or would he simply sweep things under the rug? I'm leaning toward the latter because not only did the amount of money involved have to feel like small change to the uncle, but we're talking about a relative, and most people don't want to see their loved ones in prison. Most people. Even setting aside familial attachment, having his nephew arrested for theft could be a very embarrassing public scandal that the uncle would probably want to avoid. Sure, it's not exactly a morally upright position to take, but it's not like record company owners are the most honest and ethical people on the planet. The dollar amount of the nephew's scheme was very low, while the risk of getting caught was very high. However, the chances for actual arrest and imprisonment were negligible at best, and the worst thing that would likely happen would be getting fired by his uncle. This design gets a 2.5 out of 5. The Phantom may seem unique at first. After all, by this point in the Scooby-Doo universe, the closest we've come to an evil rock star, ghost, or monster was Zombie Lila from the Mamba Wamba episode. However, I feel that the makeup would classify the nephew more as an evil clown. Obviously, the disguise was inspired by the musicians in Kiss, and the nephew's first name was also shared with one of that group's founding members. But I stand by my argument that the Phantom could be classified as an evil clown, because that pretty much describes Gene Simmons. I'm not much of a fan of Gene Simmons.
Better close the door, Scoob, like we don't want the Phantom to find us in here.
Okay, Shaggy.
Where did the Phantom come from? He was not next to the door when Shaggy opened it. Setting aside the origin of the Phantom's outfit, I would say it's easily as frightening as any other malevolent clown. Further, that exposed chest and tight, form-fitting spandex that would otherwise not be present with either a traditional clown outfit or the more family-friendly musician typically seen on Scooby-Doo introduces to the design a somewhat unsettling sexual edge. Which again pretty much describes Gene Simmons. I'm not much of a fan of Gene Simmons.
Now to see who this Phantom really is.
As is often the case with the bad guys featured in the Scooby-Doo show, the Phantom's outfit featured zero special effects that would give the gang any reason to believe it was supernatural and not simply a guy wearing makeup. Then again, it wasn't actually makeup, as Fred pulls off a mask instead of wiping paint off the nephew's face, like with Uncle Stewart. This did prevent the same odd moment from that earlier episode where makeup was able to successfully hide a full beard. It would have been interesting to see makeup do the same to a pair of glasses. By the way, what in the hell kind of sound did they use for the unmasking? That didn't sound like a rubber mask being pulled off. It sounded more like a door being closed. Like the one to Gene Simmons' tour bus when a groupie arrives asking for an autograph. I'm not much of a fan of Gene Simmons. Using the ghost of an angry ex-musician was a good choice for the nephew, considering it was supposed to be haunting a record studio, though I do question the circumstances behind the cover story.
It's just a legend, Fred. Something about a ghostly musician who wanders these corridors seeking vengeance against those who ruined his career.
Jimmy was the one who explained the origin of the Phantom, not the nephew, which implies either the story had already existed long before his need to dress up as the ghost, or the nephew did an excellent job of setting the stage for his crimes. I'm leaning toward the former because it seems the nephew only decided to dress up as the Phantom after he found out that Tony Sines, the songwriter, learned of the records theft. But from a real-world perspective, if even a moderately famous singer looked like the Phantom, wouldn't the gang have already known all about him and his death? If you name any popular musician who died young, odds are most of us would know the circumstances surrounding their passing. Mama Cass, Jim Morrison, John Lennon, Amy Winehouse. Anyone with even a passing knowledge of famous music makers would know those names and how they died. While counting so many famous singers as their friends, it's unfathomable that the gang wouldn't have known who the Phantom was prior to this episode. However, we'll set that aside and give credit to the nephew for choosing an appropriate disguise that took full advantage of not only the location, but also the legend that accompanied it. This, coupled with how scary the disguise was, earns him high marks. But he still loses some for not being quite as original as he could have been, in addition to the lack of special effects. He gets a 3.5 out of 5 for the outfit. This is yet another Scooby episode that begins with a kidnapping.
You know too much, Tony Sines, and you will not get away from me. You won't get away from me.
It's like we're watching a nightmare Jerry Reed had about being chased by an amorous Gene Simmons. Which I would not put past Gene Simmons. I'm not much of a fan of Gene Simmons.
There's no escape.
This falls under the stupid designation for a Scooby kidnapping because it wasn't necessary and only made things worse for the nephew when he abducted Sines. We find out later that this happened because the songwriter discovered that the nephew had been stealing records from the company. So why did Sines run from the Phantom? You can't say it's because he thought the ghost was real, because not only did the nephew tell Sines that he knew too much, which would be a dead giveaway to the man as to who's under the mask, but right before he was caught, Sines wrote down the nephew's name in code, hoping someone would find the sheet music and connect the dots. Both men were of roughly the same build, and the nephew was unarmed, giving Signs no reason to fear so much for his life. The guy chasing him was just wearing evil clown makeup. It'd be like if you were an accountant at a paper company and you caught one of the receptionists embezzling and they dressed up as Pennywise to scare you. Wouldn't it be more likely for you to say, "You're embarrassing yourself, Pam. Let's just wait here calmly until the police arrive"? We'll handwave that aspect and just accept that the nephew kidnapped Signs. By doing this, all he did was turn a low-level felony, embezzlement, into a high one, criminal confinement, and making it that much more difficult for his uncle to later cover everything up. It's one thing if the record company owner chooses not to press charges against a relative, but kidnapping is a serious offense and not so easy to disregard. Signs could either be looking at a massive payday to keep quiet over the attack, or the uncle could decide the cost was too much and not shield his nephew from the consequences of his actions, regardless of how much public embarrassment it would cause.
What are you two up to?
Well, yes, we just... You don't understand!
Joe just assaulted and kicked out 2 individuals that he knew were there as invited guests. Time to fire a security guard.
Here, I'll give you a boost up.
Oh, what?
Would you do it for a Scooby snack? Okay, 4. But that's my final offer.
Okay.
Since when has Shaggy been the one to bribe Scooby? If he had his own supply of Scooby snacks, why would he ever allow Velma or Daphne to talk him into doing anything scary?
Sorry, Scoob, like I'm fresh out. I'll have to owe you.
Oh, he was lying to Scooby. What a d***.
Hey, will you look at that? Hundreds of Jimmy Lewis albums.
Hundreds? That looks just like 2 or 3 dozen, tops. To be fair, I did the math, and you could comfortably fit 300 standard vinyl records in an average-sized trash can. But there's no way there's even 100 spilling out here. Another mistake the nephew made was taking that much inventory all at once. We don't know how Signs learned about the theft, but it stands to reason that he would have noticed if 4 9-foot-tall stacks of records went missing. If he decided to look around for the culprit, all he had to do was see the nephew make a couple of trips to the alley behind the studio to figure out what was going on. Had the nephew stolen the records more piecemeal, with just a few hundred albums or so at a time, he probably wouldn't have drawn so much attention to himself. The fact that he did act so recklessly adds credibility to the idea that he was in over his head with gambling debts and was desperate for a quick payday to save his skin.
This is a Tony Signs song? The handwriting is shaky. It's not like Tony at all.
Yeah, the handwriting's shaky. Also, there's just 9 notes total, which seems a little low for a rock song. There's a snarky joke to be made here about modern music being really basic with little to no actual music to it, but come on. Even the Macarena had more than 9 notes. Hey, Macarena! I told you Joe shouldn't have let Scooby into the studio. Time to fire a security guard.
I'll give you the melody line.
I'm no musician, but that seems like a hell of a lot more than 9 notes. Incidentally, this is what the song should sound like based on the sheet music shown.
Some temporary equipment. He realized what Tony had done and faked the explosions to stop the session.
Fake an explosion? Those were real sparks, and the equipment was damaged enough that the technician needed to replace it. But this does bring up another dumb move on the part of the nephew. Embezzlement requires a certain amount of discretion. The last thing the nephew should have wanted was his uncle's attention on the recording studio. Receiving an invoice to replace tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment would likely make the guy wonder what the hell was going on at his business. The nephew didn't seem to act in a manner that showed any real incentive to protect his scheme. For example, he never once put the lives of Shaggy, Scooby, or the rest in danger. The worst he did was lock up Signs when, frankly, the best way to keep himself from getting caught would have been to murder the man. Seriously, the moment that Signs discovered the records theft, it was all over for the nephew. He wasn't stealing nearly enough to run away and enjoy the rest of his days on a tropical island somewhere. At best, he had managed to score maybe the equivalent of a full year's salary. We don't know what his uncle had been paying him for his legitimate job, so it's possible that his regular pay was much higher than what he stole. Only by making Signs permanently disappear would he have been able to avoid capture. But the nephew must have understood the dollar amount in question wasn't worth a life sentence or the electric chair. If he was smart enough to understand that, he should have been smart enough to realize that there was no chance for him to get away with it at that point. It's not like he could have kept Signs locked up forever in that storeroom. Hell, if the nephew did plan on keeping him in there forever, that would have been as good as murder, as Signs would have eventually starved to death or died of dehydration.
He was stealing records from his uncle's studio and selling them for his own personal profit.
I wonder what was going through Joe's mind as he watched Fred pull off the villain's mask. Hundreds or possibly thousands of vinyl albums were being stolen right under this guy's nose. He was either in cahoots with the nephew or grossly incompetent. Time to fire a security guard.
I'm down here.
I know we're dealing with cartoon physics, but a paper airplane supporting the weight of a dog that easily weighs at least 150 pounds? I'd like to say the older episodes respected physics better, but this has always been an issue with the franchise.
Scooby did it!
Hey, captured the Phantom!
Who in the hell is responsible for stacking the media at this studio? You don't store reels of tape like that, flat and on top of each other. Those are likely the metal kind most in use at the time, and they typically weighed several pounds each. Stacked like that, it's unlikely Scooby would have scattered them when he landed. He was more likely to have broken some bones because it would have been like falling onto a pile of rocks. The best the nephew managed to do was get the records out of the studio, but no further than the alley behind the building. He stupidly kidnapped the only one who knew about his crime, but didn't have the tenacity to make the man disappear permanently, and even worse, he allowed his victim enough time to leave a note revealing his identity. He gets a 1 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the Phantom with a final due score of 2.3 out of 5. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon member and apologize in advance if I mispronounce the name. Solitera. Thank you, Solitera. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. While touring rural China, the gang are stranded when the Mystery Machine gets a flat tire. The owner of a nearby palace allows them to spend the night, but Scooby and the rest aren't the only unexpected guests, as a demon threatens to use its supernatural moon powers to turn the residents of the mansion into stone.
This visit to China sure is exciting.
They brought the Mystery Machine with them to China. China. New York was too much of a pain, but shipping their van 7,000 miles away? No big deal.
Shaggy, that's a menu from a Chinese restaurant back in the States.
Considering their history, Shaggy and Scooby shouldn't be allowed within 1,000 feet of a Chinese restaurant.
We've been following the Rampu River, so we must be here. Rampu.
There is no Rampu in China. It's also not that convincing of a name for a place in that country. It sounds more like something Scooby would use to wash his hair. And while it's nice to see that Fred is on the correct side of the road, as the Chinese do drive on the right side, just like here in the United States, he really shouldn't be driving in the first place. Not only does China require a Chinese license for all drivers, foreigners who want to apply for one of those must also have a residence permit. It's unlikely that Fred and the rest were planning on staying in the country for over 6 months, which means they probably only had a visa. The fact that he is driving could mean they simply bribed whatever officials oversaw issuing them travel permission. The Scooby Gang does come from wealthy families after all.
It's the Moon Monster!
Hey, take it easy, guys. It's just a flat tire. Maybe we can stay at the palace tonight and fix the flat in the morning.
Well, it's worth a try, Fred.
I will never understand how casual the gang are when it comes to getting stranded. The last time my car made a funny noise, I was still shaking 2 days later. Also, it's incredible enough that Fred and the rest are willing to knock on doors in the backwoods of the Ozarks just a few years after the movie Deliverance was released. But here, they are assuming 4 Americans would get a warm welcome showing up out of the blue at a Chinese palace just a few years after the worst of the Cultural Revolution and a few months before the 2 countries would officially establish diplomatic relations. Chinese-American Kim Chow-Ling recently returned to his family's homeland after inheriting their estate in Rampu. This included Rampu Palace, a large mansion that local folklore claimed was the home of the Moon Monster, a mythical creature with the ability to turn its victims into stone.
This is Kim Chow-Ling, the new owner of the Palace of Rampu.
Pleased to meet you. Like, how do we stop this?
While bowing does exist in Chinese culture, it's not quite as exaggerated as seen here. Japan is where bowing is much more important. Shaggy and Scooby could have simply shaken Ling's hand.
But the treasures have a curse on them. If you keep them, everyone in the palace will be in danger.
Like, does that include cowards?
Everyone!
Everyone!
Ling's uncle, Chen Wong-sing, dressed up as the Moon Monster to convince the young man to toss the family fortune into an adjacent river. The gold and jewels would then wash up in a nearby cave where Sing would collect them before making his getaway. To convince everyone of the monster's danger, as well as to cover up his escape, Sing faked his own stone transformation. Wait a minute. An unscrupulous uncle with a beard used the threat of a supernatural creature to cheat a younger relative out of the family fortune, as well as staged his own death in order to get away? Why does that sound familiar? This villain plan is almost entirely a rehash of Uncle Stuart's scheme from What the Heck's Going On from the first season of Where Are You? Though instead of pretending to become elderly before becoming a skeleton, Sing borrowed the execution method of Dr. Najib by turning victims into stone statues. I don't know how to go about determining how much this was worth to Sing because there are a couple of significant issues with the plot, or at least its execution. For starters, I have difficulty believing that Ling's family could have had that much wealth, considering all of the political and social turmoil under which China had been embroiled up to the year this episode was set. China is a repressive communist country, and from 1966 to 1976, its government worked to brutally suppress what it considered undesirable elements in what was called the Cultural Revolution. Those persecuted included scientists and intellectuals, as well as those who were deemed to be trying to push capitalist ideas and remnants of the old hierarchy. Would Ling's wealthy family have been allowed to keep their fortune? Or does this point to his relatives having been elite members of the Communist Party responsible for the mayhem? Is it possible that the Chinese government, deciding to once again embrace certain aspects of capitalism by working to advance trade with the United States, asked a Chinese American from abroad to return to claim his ancestral grounds and fortune? This might have been their way of showing the importance of improving relations with the American government. Sing, as an older family member, may have had a legitimate grievance over having his inheritance taken from him by the Communist Party, and his actions in this episode could be justified from a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
All of this supposition, however, is based on the idea that Ling's family fortune was real. Why do I have my doubts as to its legitimacy?
Now what?
Now we'll just do what the legend says to do.
I'll get it, Scooby.
Yeah, Scooby, who do you think you are? Daphne? If that bag was filled with real gold and jewels, it would weigh thousands of pounds, and neither Ling, Fred, nor Scooby could have picked it up that easily. I guess we need to ignore the weight. If that bag was filled with real gold and jewels, it would have immediately sunk to the bottom of the river, not float to the surface to be washed into the cave.
Nice catch, Kim.
If that bag was filled with real gold and jewels, Ling would have been squished like a jelly donut. Real gold doesn't float, but do you know what can? Costume jewelry, if it's made of less dense metal or other materials like leather or paste. Ling's fortune doesn't appear to be legitimate by real-world standards, which would make Sing's entire operation worthless. I'm going to give the producers the benefit of the doubt that the treasure was real, which would make what's in that bag difficult to value as we don't see everything that's in there. The one time we see the palace treasure room, it's obvious that much of the inventory is in the form of artwork and pottery, so what Fred is holding is likely just gold and jewelry. It appears to be a typical burlap sack, which, by my calculations, has a holding capacity of around 10 cubic feet. If it was filled with gold like what we see here, it could weigh around 3 tons. Can you see why we need to ignore the weight? It would also be worth close to $20 million in 1978, or $100 million in today's money. Yes, the bag wasn't filled with just gold, nor was it filled to capacity. But either way, it's a massive amount of loot, and certainly worth it for Sing to dress up as the moon monster to steal it.
We think Lin Fu is right.
Yeah, like you should throw the gold into the bay.
Trust us, Kim. We think we can help.
Judging by how easily Ling trusted the 4 teenagers he only met that day to toss his treasure into the river, having his uncle and servant, 2 men he presumably knew for much longer, also advocate for the act, meant it highly likely that he would have been willing to forsake his fortune over the curse. If the gang hadn't been there, Sing would have easily gotten away with it. I'm giving the evil uncle a 4 out of 5 for the design. The only thing that really worked against him was how unoriginal the scheme was. The Moon Monster represents a very welcome return of special effects for a Scooby villain. While the disguise didn't feature all the bells and whistles, the lack of flying was more than made up for by the glowing and transparency of the outfit. This was another one of those "who was this for" moments in the franchise. Why was Sing walking around in disguise here? The palace was empty except for Ling and the servant, and later dialogue makes it evident that Shaggy and Scooby were the first to actually see the moon monster. If Sing's plan hinged on frightening his nephew enough to give up the family fortune, why didn't he appear in front of him at that time? Like the cat medallion from a few episodes back, the glowing effect was accompanied by an eerie sound which was never explained nor a necessary part of the costume. At least this time around, they chose to reuse the sound effects from the Space Kook's ghost ship, which always helps to instill a sense of dread in the audience.
Shaggy, Scooby, watch out!
Shaggy, Scooby, you're glowing.
I am?
They're also transparent. That is some powerful flour. I wonder if it's gluten-free as well. There was so much glowing in the episode, even Shaggy, Scooby, and Ling's treasure wanted to get in on the act. Though it must be said that while the shimmering was explained by Ling's use of a fluorescent powder, at no point was any explanation provided for the transparency, even for when Shaggy and Scooby were briefly and inexplicably see-through. Okay, we know why the Moon Monster and Shaggy and Scooby were occasionally transparent. It's the same reason why the Snow Beast kept changing its size throughout its episode. To be charitable, there's always a possibility that an earlier draft of the script included an explanation, like the old trusty film projector, but got dropped later after some of the earlier scenes were animated. I'm fairly confident, though, that it was just the usual sloppy production values that plagued this series. But as far as mistakes go, this one is a bit perplexing. The animators had to go out of their way to include the transparency effect, which was complex to accomplish in the days of cell animation, meaning they likely spent more time rendering those scenes than if they just left the moon monster fully opaque. This was not the first time that the monster or ghost featured was based on Asian folklore, or at least alleged Asian folklore. Where Are You featured both the snow ghost and Zen Tuo and his zombie henchmen. The former based on the Himalayan Yeti, and the latter on... I have no idea what those guys were supposed to represent. I'm guessing just generic supernatural entities. The moon monster does not lose any points for sharing a regional origin with the other two, however, as that would be as unfair as claiming a werewolf wasn't unique because the legend originated in Europe like vampires. Thus, a monster made of moonbeams could be considered highly original, though its inexplicable ability to turn its victims to stone is just as baffling here as it was for Dr. Najib's mummy. Unlike those earlier ghosts, the producers did a much better job on the moon monster, giving it a definite Asian feel as the face looks very much like a traditional Chinese demon or even a Japanese oni. It's also a much more frightening design than the previous Asian-influenced villain outfits. You don't have to be Chinese to find this guy disturbing as hell. Singh also gets credit for choosing an appropriate disguise, as the Rampu Palace was already associated with the supernatural, and anyone who knew the legend of the moon monster would fill in any blank spots in his outfit with their own preconceptions. But again, unlike, say, the Jaguaro, fear of this supernatural bad guy was not dependent upon a knowledge of local folklore. Even better, as Singh was Chinese, this disguise does not fall into the realm of cultural appropriation. In fact, who better to disguise himself as a monster that haunted a family's lineage than a member of that family himself? I'm giving the moon monster a design score of 4.5 out of 5. It was very original, scary, and appropriate for the location. The only thing I found wrong with it was the nonsensical manner in which it dispatched its victims. If there's one constant when it comes to Scooby villains, it would have to be how often they dream up incredibly complicated schemes to accomplish what should otherwise have been a straightforward crime. In this situation, all Singh wanted was to get his hands on the family fortune. The fortune in this case was quite vast, and from what we saw in the episode, poorly organized. If he could have avoided being too greedy, the corrupt uncle could have easily stolen several $1 million worth of gold and jewelry, and his nephew likely would have never even known it was missing in the first place. If he was still determined to get his hands on everything, there were easier ways for Singh to accomplish this. Of course, the easiest would have involved murder, and I realize that's not something everyone can stomach, which is why I tend to award those Scooby villains willing to do so a bit more points for showing the resolve needed to get things done. Here, for example, to keep the crime scene clean, Singh could have found a way to bloodlessly kill Ling, perhaps a poison or strangulation. After finding a way to dispose of the body, he could have carved a stone statue of his nephew to leave behind, and then sit back and relax as the moon monster legend took over. After all, their servant was already convinced of the creature's existence, so that would have left 2 men to convince the authorities. Who knows how many other superstitious members of the community would have been convinced of the moon monster legend enough to come to the men's defense? Without a body or evidence of a homicide, no matter how suspicious they were, investigators would eventually have to let the case grow cold while Singh remained free to enjoy the family fortune. It's also possible the authorities might not push too hard to solve the missing man's disappearance, as he was from the United States, and there could be lingering animosity that a foreigner had taken possession of a Chinese palace. Yes, Singh was technically Chinese as well as American, but it's likely many in the neighborhood wouldn't consider him really Chinese. However, if my earlier theory holds any water that the Chinese government had encouraged Ling's repatriation to foster better relations between the two countries, they would have found the man's disappearance embarrassing, and rather than sweep it under the rug, they would have devoted unlimited resources to get to the bottom of things. They wouldn't even have to find Ling's remains and could have simply prosecuted Singh, since he would have been the one to have benefited the most. The appearance of justice would likely have been more important than actual justice to the Chinese government. Under these circumstances, it was probably better for Singh not to have harmed his nephew, so he won't lose any points for not being bloodthirsty enough to resort to murder.
My uncle collected the ancient tools of China, some of them very valuable. That carving tool, for instance, is worth a fortune.
Ah yes, the ancient Chinese brace drill and the ancient Chinese bubble level, both invented in Europe in the 15th and 17th centuries, respectively.
He rang the gong, and when we got there, it looked like a moon monster had turned your uncle into a statue.
What was the statue then?
Your uncle carved that himself with the ancient carving tool.
Singh did fake his own kidnapping, which is rarely a good idea. But in this situation, Ling's natural gullibility, augmented by the prodding of the superstitious servant, meant that if the gang hadn't been there, the stone statue Singh carved might have likely convinced his nephew of the moon monster's veracity enough to surrender his fortune. It would have also made it unlikely for anyone to look for the missing uncle either. Presumably, though, Ling would still need to notify the local authorities of the missing person, and unless Singh had managed to bribe one or two people in power to look the other way, I find it difficult to believe investigators would look at the stone statue and write the disappearance off as an act of the gods. I think at best all this would have done for Singh was to give him a large head start as he escaped the country with his stolen gold and jewelry. It doesn't help that he had so visibly greased the bottom of the statue's feet, making it crystal clear that it came from a hidden room behind. Why didn't he use a towel? That's how I scoot appliances around in my kitchen. Those black marks had to have been super obvious even to the kids watching this for the first time back in 1978.
Our guests should not travel so late at night.
Is it that late already, huh? Time sure flies when you're scared silly.
It's weird that Singh is trying to keep the gang from leaving, when his whole plan hinges on convincing his nephew how dangerous the palace is with the moon monster running around. But then again, the villain's entire interaction with the gang is strange, because for a plot centered around scaring his nephew, Singh spends almost all his time chasing Shaggy and Scooby. Ling only sees the moon monster twice in the entire episode, and that's including the final chase at the end.
Hand over the treasure.
Head for the bridge!
They caught the moon monster.
Speaking of which, his capture was just embarrassing. Fred hadn't devised some elaborate trap to stop the moon monster. He simply confronted Singh at the cave when the man collected the treasure and correctly assumed the villain would chase Shaggy and Scooby to a nearby bridge where they would knock him into the water. Singh had the treasure at that point. He didn't need to chase anyone. He should have just made his getaway. Even if the gang had explained to Ling what was going on and that it was his uncle behind the scheme, who knows how long it would take for the nephew to contact the authorities, let alone convince them of what had happened. This would have allowed Singh a huge head start, since presumably the man had already made arrangements for what to do after he snagged the loot. Singh wisely avoided harming his nephew and effectively staged his own kidnapping, but the rest of his follow-through was poor. Instead of focusing on just his nephew, he allowed himself to be distracted by Shaggy and Scooby up to the point that it directly led to his capture. And the only reason his plan succeeded enough to get Ling to dump the treasure into the river is because Fred convinced the nephew to do so as bait. He gets a 2.5 out of 5 for the operation. This leaves the moon monster with a final due score of 3.7 out of 5.
Egg foo young, chop suey, chow mein.
It's a common misconception for Americans that chop suey is a traditional Chinese dish. While it is popular in Chinese restaurants in this country, it likely originated here in the United States sometime in the 19th century. Granted, Ling was a Chinese American, so it's perfectly feasible that he developed a taste for chop suey when he was living here and decided to bring the recipe with him back to his ancestral home.
It looks like Scooby's eyes are bigger than his stomach.
You mean bigger than his mouth, don't you, Kim?
Scooby is about to choke to death and they're cracking jokes? Worst dog owners ever. And that's my ranking of the villains from the 6th set of episodes of the 3rd season of the Scooby-Doo show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. I've been feeling a bit uncomfortable with all the low scores I've been giving to so many of the villains in the somewhat disappointing 3rd season of the Scooby-Doo show. And for a while, I really thought the Moon Monster was going to be an outlier with its impressive design and outfit scores. But the more I rewatched the episode looking for reasons to bump the operation score up, it actually had the opposite effect and kept dropping instead. There are only 4 more villains left to go for this series, so let's keep our fingers crossed for something impressive. I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout out in the next regular video produced after they join. Do you suppose Shaggy ever gave Scooby those 4 Scooby snacks he was owed?